Do you think the most terrifying punishment in history was the guillotine? A quick blade. A moment of pain. And then, nothing. For centuries, this device has been remembered as the symbol of ultimate cruelty. But for most of human history, it would have been considered merciful. Because long before the guillotine, power relied on something far more effective than speed. Time. Human history knows punishments so carefully designed in their cruelty that even modern horror films struggle to reproduce their logic. Not because they were violent, but because they were deliberate. And the most disturbing detail is not how people died, but where it happened. In public. In front of families. In front of children. In city squares that, on ordinary days, served as markets and meeting places. Crowds gathered. They laughed. They ate. They drank wine. And they watched death, much like we watch movies today. From antiquity to the Middle Ages. From Persia to Europe. From China to the Mediterranean. Across cultures and centuries, societies did not simply invent ways to kill. They engineered ways to make suffering visible. Slow. Spectacular. Impossible to ignore. Because fear has always been the most reliable currency of power. Rulers understood something fundamental. A silent death teaches nothing. But a public one reshapes behavior. Imagine a city square. The sun stands at its highest point. Heat trembles above stone pavement. The smell of dust, sweat, and wine fills the air. A wooden platform rises at the center. Hundreds of people gather around it. Children sit on their parents' shoulders. Vendors move through the crowd, selling food and drink. This is not a moment of panic. It is anticipation. Because today, there will be a performance. A performance of punishment. In many cities, executions were announced in advance. They appeared in civic calendars. People planned their day around them. In some places, spectators even paid for better views. This was not chaos. It was ritual. Today, we remember these punishments as acts of cruelty. But for those who lived at the time, they served a different purpose. They were lessons. Carefully staged demonstrations of what happened to those who disobeyed. Warnings delivered not through words, but through bodies. We begin with one of the most terrifying methods ever recorded. A punishment designed not to kill quickly, but to let the body decay while the mind remained aware. A form of execution in which a human being was left to rot alive under the open sun. This takes us back more than 2,000 years, to the 5th century before our era, when the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Before we go further, one clarification is necessary. What follows is historical documentary material. Descriptions of violence appear not for shock, but to understand how power functioned in the past. Some details come from ancient sources. Others are reconstructions based on multiple accounts. Where history is uncertain, that uncertainty matters. But what cannot be disputed is that this punishment existed, and that people once gathered to watch it. Our main description comes from a man writing centuries later, around the year 100 AD, looking back at the practices of an earlier empire. The execution method, later known as scaphism, often called the Persian boat, is described by several ancient authors. The most detailed account comes from Plutarch, a Greek historian writing in the 1st century AD. He attributes the punishment to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and describes it as a sentence reserved not for common criminals, but for those accused of treason or extreme betrayal. Some details may reflect exaggeration. Ancient authors often emphasize horror to condemn foreign powers. But the core logic of the punishment is consistent across sources, and biologically plausible. And that logic is what makes it terrifying. A hot day in Persia. The sun is high. The air is still. In the middle of a slow-moving river, 2 wooden boats are bound together, one placed over the other. Between them lies a person. Their body is trapped inside the narrow space. Only the head, arms, and legs protrude. They cannot move. They cannot turn. They cannot escape. This is not a device meant to restrain. It is a device meant to display. The boats are pushed away from the shore, far enough that voices no longer carry, but close enough that the body can still be seen. According to Plutarch, the execution began not with pain, but with nourishment. The victim was force-fed milk and honey. Not offered. Not consumed voluntarily. Forced. The mixture was poured down the throat until the body could no longer resist swallowing. To an ancient observer, this might have looked merciful. But there was a reason. Milk and honey cause severe digestive distress when consumed in excess. They accelerate internal decay, diarrhea, and dehydration. In other words, the body began to rot from the inside, while the heart continued to beat. This was not accidental. It was calculated. Then came the honey. The exposed skin, face, arms, legs, was coated in a thick, sticky layer. In the sun, it glistened. To insects, it was an invitation. The boats were pushed into the center of the river, where heat and moisture intensified the effect. At first, flies arrived. Then more. Hundreds. Then thousands. They crawled into the nostrils. Into the ears. Into the corners of the mouth. They laid eggs under the skin, in wounds, in places the victim could not reach. The only movement still possible was blinking. Screaming no longer mattered. No one on the shore could hear. Ancient sources suggest survival for several days. Sometimes longer. Biologically, this is possible. As long as vital organs remain intact and dehydration is slow, consciousness can persist far longer than we expect. What matters here is not the exact number of days. What matters is the intent. This punishment was designed to prolong awareness, not end it. After a day, the body changed. Larvae hatched. They moved beneath the skin, into open sores, into eye sockets. The body decayed, but the brain still understood what was happening. The sun burned overhead. Honey fermented on the skin. Insects did not leave. Fish gathered beneath the boats, drawn by scent. The river itself became part of the execution. This continued for days. Sometimes nearly a week. A week of living decomposition. When death finally came, the body already resembled a corpse. But a corpse that had been breathing the day before. Officially, this punishment was described as a sentence for treason. Functionally, it served another role. It was not justice. It was theater. A demonstration of what power could do to a human body when it was no longer considered human. To those who lived alongside it, this was not horror. It was normal. People adapt quickly. Even to the sight of death rotting in water. And that normalization was precisely the point. If the Persian boat was death by decay, then the wheel of torture was death by order. Not chaos. Not improvisation. Structure. We now move forward in time, to 17th century Europe, an age of courts, laws, and public order, where punishment was no longer improvised, but regulated. A city square wakes to noise. Merchants shout. Wine is poured. Church bells ring. This is not a day of mourning. It is a public event. In many towns, executions on the wheel were scheduled to coincide with market days. The crowd was already there. At the center of the square stands a large wooden wheel, mounted horizontally on a frame. It resembles farm equipment. Something familiar. That familiarity matters. Next to it stands the executioner. He wears a leather apron, not as costume, but as protection. In his hands, a heavy iron bar or hammer. Before him lies the condemned man. Stretched out. Bound with ropes. Positioned carefully. Like an object prepared for assembly. The first blow lands on the leg. There is a sound, not a scream, but a deep, unmistakable crack. Bone. Each strike is deliberate. Measured. Because this execution follows rules. In many regions, the executioner was given a specific number of blows. Not more. Not fewer. Each limb had its place in the sequence. Breaking bones in the wrong order was considered unprofessional. Sometimes even illegal. This was not cruelty performed in anger. It was violence performed as a craft. The logic was simple. Justice, like music, required rhythm. The crowd reacts. Some gasp. Some look away. Others laugh. This was theater. Each sound traveled across the square. Each crack confirmed that the ritual was proceeding correctly. When the limbs were broken, the body was lifted, woven through the spokes of the wheel, bent into shapes the human form was never meant to take. The wheel was raised vertically. Above the crowd hung a body that still breathed but could no longer move. Sometimes, the executioner offered what was called mercy, a final blow to the chest. But more often, that blow was withheld. Because the wheel was not designed for speed. It was designed for duration. Execution on the wheel rarely ended in minutes. It could take hours. Sometimes days. During that time, the square returned to normal. People went home. Shops closed. Life continued. Above it all, the wheel remained. A reminder. The wheel taught the crowd that justice was orderly, predictable, unavoidable. The violence was regulated. And that regulation made it easier to accept. The Persian boat showed what power could do to a body over time. The wheel showed something else. That suffering could be administered with rules, schedules, and professional standards. And that terrified people even more. Because it meant this was not madness. It was governance. Not every execution relied on exposure or broken bones. Some were built to be remembered. Several centuries earlier, in the Greek world of the 6th century before our era, punishment followed a different aesthetic. Ancient Sicily, the city of Acragas. Its ruler, Phalaris, wanted a punishment that would speak even after the victim could not. A craftsman named Perilaus offered an object. A hollow bull, cast entirely in bronze. Life-sized. Heavy. Polished until it gleamed. From the outside, it looked ceremonial. From the inside, it was empty. A person was locked inside. A fire was lit beneath. As the bronze heated, the air became unbearable. But the cruelty was not only in the heat. It was in the sound. Pipes inside the bull transformed screams into roars. To the crowd, it sounded as if the statue itself were alive. Pain was aestheticized. And when pain becomes spectacle, empathy becomes optional. According to legend, Phalaris tested the invention on its creator. Some say he later spared him. Others say he did not. What is certain is this. Phalaris himself would eventually die the same way. His own invention became his execution. The bronze bull became a symbol. A warning. A story that survived long after the city itself faded. There were also executions designed not to destroy the body, but to preserve the mind. This method appears sporadically across different periods, from ancient Persia to late medieval Europe, always reserved for moments of extreme defiance. Sawing in half was one of them. The condemned was suspended upside down. Blood rushed toward the brain. Consciousness was delayed. The saw began between the legs. Slowly. Deliberately. The purpose was not efficiency. It was awareness. Historical accounts suggest some victims remained conscious until the chest cavity was reached. This execution was rare. Reserved for moments when authority wanted a specific message delivered. That resistance would be experienced consciously. Fully. In China, this logic survived far longer, from the medieval period into the final years of the Qing dynasty. In imperial China, Lingqi followed a different logic. Often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, it was not chaos. It was regulated, codified, morally justified. Each cut was shallow, measured. Vital organs were avoided. Life was preserved intentionally. Lingqi was reserved for crimes believed to stain the social order itself. Treason. Parricide. The body reflected moral harmony. To destroy it gradually was to expose corruption piece by piece. The final documented case occurred in 1905. Not in antiquity. At the dawn of the modern world. As with other executions, the crowd watched. For them, this was instruction. After death, the body was sometimes displayed, not to humiliate, but to erase. Death here was administrative. Across cultures, punishments differed in form and belief. But they shared one function. They redefined the person. Not as an individual, but as a message. The condemned body became text. Something meant to be read. Children watched. They grew up remembering. Fear lasted longer than the event itself. Eventually, punishment became identity. You were no longer punished for what you did. You were punished for what you represented. When executions ended, the square returned to normal. Blood was washed away. Bread was sold. Children played. This is one of the most unsettling truths. Not the violence itself, but how quickly it disappeared. Executions were absorbed into routine. That is how power survives. Not through constant terror, but repetition. The square never vanished. It changed shape. Today, punishment is rarely physical. But it is still public. Still ritualized. Still watched. And when it ends, we scroll on. Across more than 2 millennia, the methods changed. The logic did not. These executions were not created by monsters. They were created by ordinary people following law, custom, and belief. And the most important question history leaves us with is not how cruel people once were, but how easily cruelty becomes normal. When everyone is invited to look,